This month, I mouse in a circle and play with a hinge. This month, we're doing things a little bit differently. We're going to focus a bit more on the back end decision making and design process for the 3D model itself. So to start, we took measurements from our yoga mat. The inner measurement was roughly 40 millimeters, which is this circle here. We offset it in by 4 millimeters so that we could not have just a fully solid cylinder, save some print time and material. And then we measured the outer diameter, which was about 110 millimeters, and offset at 7 so that we have a nice lip around the outside of our stand. And then we've created these lines here, which we'll get into later. So the first operation is to extrude a base platform out of all the circles. I think went about 15 millimeters. And now we are going to extrude up the basis of our stand. Now, this is all well and good. Everything will fit around the mat correctly, but the idea of this piece is that we have something that stops our mat from unrolling. So that set of blinds that we talked about earlier is going to be extruded out of the side and become an armature that essentially puts pressure on the mat and keeps it from unraveling. Now that we have our base shape, we're going to add some fillets. I understand that most people will call them fillets, but I grew up in a country where French is our second language, and every time I see that word, that's just how it gets pronounced. Moving on, we need to add a bit more geometry to the top of the armature so that I can put a bit more pressure on the mat and really make sure that it's going to stay wrapped up nice and tight. So we've drawn this here. We're going to revolve it around the center axis as opposed to extrude it so we can keep a nice curvature and it'll mate really well with the side of the mat. With that done, we need to kind of trim the edges a little bit, so we'll put another sketch on top, projecting the top surface of the arm and then extending it out the sides, and then we can extrude down and cut those excess edges off. With that done, we can move on to the next step, which is splitting it into multiple pieces so it can hinge like you saw teased in the first part of the video. And for that, we're going to create another sketch. Now on this sketch, we have created our base shape and then offset it about 0.5 millimeter, so we have a little bit of air gap. When we assemble it together, it won't be binding on itself or anything. Now that that is all in place, we can do an extrusion to start cutting the pieces apart. For this one, I did a two-side extrusion, so the bottom side goes down 7 millimeters and then the top side goes up 25. Really, it's just anything to get it above that lip and separate the arm from the rest of the body. The last piece we have to do now is, because we're still connected at the bottom, create another sketch so that we can disconnect that piece. We create an offset plane, new sketch, project the old sketch onto it, extend it out a little bit, and then do an extrusion down 0.5 millimeter, give ourselves that little bit of airspace so that things can move around and not bind. And as you can see, it is two pieces that are separate. The next part is to start building out the hinge mechanism. So we're going to start with this middle circle. That's going to be a pin, which is a part of the arm. The outer circle is our offset, which is going to denote the captive space that it goes into on the base. And then we have these two little nubbins that are going to be the pieces that it kind of snap fits past to stay in place so that when we pull the mat up, it doesn't just fall out. We'll just push it down from the top and everything's going to stay in place. So we start with an extrusion. We'll round off the edge a little bit so that it looks a teeny bit nicer, and then we will go and mirror it to the other side. I used the feature mirror and picked the extrusion and the fillet feature prior so that we can have it on both sides. And then we can move on to creating our little cavities in the base with the nubs that are going to make it snap fit in there really, really nice. Now that that side's created, same thing, we'll mirror the feature to the opposite side using the center plane, and now we've created our hinge. There's only one problem left to solve for this thing to actually work, and you can see there's no space for it to move, so we have to create a gap so that the piece actually has a space to hinge down into. And we could just stop here, leave it like this, and print it, but my design brain kicks in and says I don't really want this giant gap in the bottom of my model. I would rather have an overlapping piece or something like that that looks just a little bit nicer. To give ourselves some reference of how we want to make it overlap, we'll use the move tool, torque it 10 degrees around the hinge axis, and that gives us a good base to draw our sketch for our overlapping geometry and the cuts that we're going to use to create that. So this is what we're going to use. The middle profile is what we're going to add to the base to close up the gap. And then the outer offset profile is what we're going to cut away from the arms so that they don't interfere with each other. Now that we have that drawn, we will move our piece back to its original position. We will do a couple revolves. First one to add the geometry, which you can see now we have a huge interference point. So we've added the geometry to the base, but it interferes quite heavily with the arm. So we need to cut away a piece of the arm so that it doesn't interfere. Looking at this, it's still going to interfere a little bit. This lip here is going to interfere with the bottom lip there. So we're going to take our chamfer tool. I use the distance and angle feature of it. Put a 10-degree angle, stretch it out to 15 millimeters, and now we have this really nice overlap, and it is not going to interfere with itself as it moves. So now we can take this and go and print it, but I have one last pro tip for you, especially if you are making models that have moving parts and they are on the larger side like this one. If we were to print this whole, it would take about 3 hours for each piece, so we're waiting 6 hours to find out that potentially our hinge doesn't work and our offsets were wrong. I like to double check my work before running a big print, and it's really simple with this piece. All we're going to do is draw this nice little rectangle here and then use press pull extrusion with the intersection feature enabled, which will give us this nice little nubbin of our hinge. It prints out in about 20 minutes, and that way we can do a couple iterations if we need to, wasting less time and less materials, making our process to a finished product more efficient. After a few hours of printing, we're ready to assemble it together. We'll take our base and our arm and snap it together. We already know this is going to work just great because we did our test print beforehand. It snaps into place really nice and the hinge works well. Finally, we can take our yoga mat and place it inside, keeping everything nice and tidy.